call Mark Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Who has more than 30 seconds.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr Speaker, and it's a real pleasure to stand and take a call on the Civil Defence Emergency Management Bill. And I just want to acknowledge the Minister, Honourable Nikki Kaye, because we may not think it, but actually this is actually a really important bill. And I just want to hark back to sort of 2007, 2008, when in another role, another time, I was involved with an initiative that was born out of a World Economic Forum decision to form some of the big logistics companies around the world to form what was called LET teams, emergency logistics teams. And the purpose for those teams was to be able to deploy into areas that have been hit by humanitarian disaster and were in need of first responders to get supply chain solutions and logistics and medical supplies and food to the people that had been cut off from that type of support. And so I was very lucky that I was involved in LET teams deploying to places like Lebanon, Indonesia, Pakistan when they had the earthquakes there, and Haiti. And one thing that I really noticed, one thing that became glaringly obvious is that especially in these remote areas, governments of course should be taking the lead in terms of coordinating humanitarian groups and logistics companies in the private sector and being able to actually, the private sector is very efficient, they can get things done, but of course they rely very heavily on government support to be able to reduce compliance issues and access and transit through airports and ports and things like that, to be able to coordinate and allow them to actually get on the ground and deliver the aid. And one thing that I really noticed and became quite apparent is actually governments sometimes aren't really that good at doing that. And it highlighted the fact that for them to be able to support and respond properly to a civil defence incident, is there has to be a lot of planning, and there has to be genuine strategic planning around how they're actually going to go from a contingency type environment when you're dealing with a situation that may be a week, 2, 3 weeks old, and then transitioning into more of a sustainment type operation where they actually the support may be required for 6 months, 12 months, anything up to 18 months. And so I just wanted to highlight the fact that actually the work that the Minister's done and the Ministry has done around this is actually really important. New Zealand, of course, we're really lucky. We're not necessarily facing the same challenges that you might have in an environment like Lebanon or Pakistan or Haiti. But the fact of the matter is it's really important that the government is able to make sure that we've got a very good policy setting and legislation that will allow for that coordination and allow for that transition from a contingency type environment into sustainment and sustainability. Unfortunately, we are actually subjected to our own issues when it comes to, we saw obviously what happened, the tragedy that we faced in Christchurch with the earthquakes. We have adverse weather events all around the country. I've had them in my own electorate of Rodney, and I've also had a couple of tsunami warnings that we've had to deal with as well. And when you've got a peninsula with 30,000 people on, it's actually pretty important to make sure that we've got really robust civil defence action plans in place. So what the bill actually does is the bill amends the Civil Defence Emergency Management Act of 2002 to enable better recovery from New Zealand's most frequent emergencies and those sort of from the small to moderate scale. The Civil Defence Emergency Management Bill will amend the CDM Act to, number 1, establish a legislative framework for recovery management by providing a mandate for recovery managers and by requiring high-level preparatory recovery planning. This is really important so that there's a standardised set of policies and guidelines that recovery managers are able to refer to and work to so that we have a standardised program right throughout New Zealand. It supports a seamless transition from response into the initial recovery phase by establishing a transition notice mechanism that will make some emergency powers available for a specified period of time. And I will talk about the those transition notices a little bit later in my speech, but they are actually very important and a very important part of the overall work that's been done on this. It's to establish a permanent legislative authority, and of course that is going to allow some proper focus in terms of appropriation. The bill is actually the first stage of a wider review into the legislative framework for recovery. The second stage will address the legislative framework required for recovery from large-scale emergencies, and I gave an example earlier of the tragedy and the earthquake that we faced in Canterbury. Historically, most attention has been given to preparing for and responding to an event. However, as we have seen in the Manawatu-Whanganui region following the severe storm in June, the clean-up and recovery phase can involve a huge amount of work on both the front end and then, of course, the continued clean-up. The new law will give clarity to those leading this work and will help ensure it can be carried out as swiftly and effectively as possible. It will do this by providing appropriate authority for those directing, coordinating and managing the recovery. And that's actually really important because there's nothing more frustrating for emergency services and a civil defence team trying to make things happen and not being actually clear or sure around the authority that they actually have under the Act. I said I'd speak about the transition notice, so I'll just touch on the transition notice very quickly. The transition notices will enable civil defence emergency management officials to, number one, carry out works, clear roads and other public spaces, and remove, dispose of secure or make safe dangerous structures and materials. Again, Christchurch and Christchurch City highlighted the importance of being able to do this quickly. Enter into premises, for example, to save a life, prevent an injury, or to rescue and remove injured or endangered persons. These powers will ensure that what was achieved during the response is not destabilised, moving into that contingency and sustainability phase, putting life and property back at risk and or derailing an effective and timely recovery. It is proposed that these powers could only be used during a defined transition phase. Their use must be proportionate, reflecting the consequences and scale of the emergency, and they must only be exercised to the extent reasonably necessary for the public interest. A declaration of a state of emergency is not necessary for the issuing of a transition notice, and that's actually quite important to highlight, because some emergencies will generate impacts of sufficient severity that the recovery may be very challenging initially, but the safety of the public and property is not an immediate danger, meaning that maybe a state of emergency wasn't declared, but it's still actually quite important to be able to issue a transition notice. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm very happy to stand in support of the Civil Defence Emergency Management Bill. Thank you.
I call Jan